My grandpa has lived in the same quiet neighborhood for more than 30 years. The kind of place where people wave while mowing lawns, kids ride bikes until sunset, and nothing dramatic ever really happens. He's old school, Korean War era mindset. Even if he never served, believes in minding his business, paying his dues, and treating authority with respect. That's exactly why what happened to him shook our entire family to the core. It started on a Tuesday morning. Grandpa was outside trimming the hedges along his driveway, moving slow but steady, when two men pulled up in a white SUV with magnetic decals slapped on the doors. The decals said, HOA compliance. No phone number. No official logo. Just enough to look real if you didn't know what to look for. Grandpa didn't question it. Why would he? Over the years, the HOA had sent letters before about fence height, trash cans, nonsense like that. The two men approached him with clipboards, wearing dark polo shirts and cheap badges clipped to their belts. They spoke fast and confident, telling him he was in violation for unauthorized exterior modifications. Grandpa tried to explain he hadn't changed anything, that the hedges had been there longer than both of them combined. One of the men cut him off, raising his voice, telling him he needed to comply immediately. That's when things went wrong. Grandpa leaned on his cane and asked for paperwork. That simple request flipped a switch. The taller guy stepped closer, invading his space, while the other moved behind him. Grandpa lost his balance when one of them grabbed his arm. Not hard at first, but enough to scare him. He stumbled, tried to pull away, and went down on the concrete. There was a sickening crack. Neighbors later said they heard him yell. By the time anyone got outside, the SUV was already speeding away. An ambulance came. Police came. Grandpa's arm was broken clean enough that the doctors said it was consistent with a fall, but the bruising told another story. He kept apologizing to everyone, saying he should have just listened, that he didn't want trouble. That hurt almost as much as the injury. A man who raised 3 kids, worked 40 years, and never asked for help, now questioning himself because 2 cowards in fake uniforms decided to play tough. When the family gathered at the hospital, the mood wasn't sadness. It was quiet fury. That's when my cousins arrived. They're not the loud, reckless stereotype people imagine. They ride motorcycles, yeah, but they're disciplined, loyal, and terrifyingly organized when someone they love gets hurt. When they heard fake HOA officers, something changed in their expressions. They knew exactly what that meant. Scammers. Intimidators. People who rely on fear and uniforms to bully the vulnerable. The police said they were investigating. The HOA claimed they didn't recognize the men. No security footage available. No witnesses willing to go on record yet. Everything felt slow, careful, procedural. Too careful. Standing in that hospital room, watching my grandpa struggle to lift a cup of water with one arm in a cast, it became clear. Whatever justice looked like, it wasn't going to arrive quickly, and it definitely wasn't going to arrive on its own. And that was the moment our family decided we weren't waiting anymore. The day after Grandpa was discharged, the house felt different. Quieter. The TV was on, but no one was really watching it. Grandpa sat in his recliner with his arm in a cast, staring at the wall like he was replaying the moment over and over. Every few minutes, he'd say the same thing. They looked official. And every time it made my jaw tighten a little more. My cousins didn't talk much either, but they were doing something far more dangerous than yelling. They were observing. First thing they did was verify what we already suspected. One cousin drove straight to the HOA office. No confrontation. No threats. Just questions. He asked for the names of the compliance officers assigned to Grandpa Street. The receptionist looked confused. Pulled out a binder. Then another. No record. No scheduled inspections. No violations logged. She even admitted, quietly, that the HOA had received complaints recently about fake notices being left on doors, but nothing physical until now. That changed everything. Another cousin canvassed the neighborhood on foot, talking to neighbors Grandpa trusted. Slowly, the pieces came together. A woman 3 houses down said she'd seen the same white SUV a week earlier. A man across the street admitted he'd been warned, by someone claiming to be HOA about paying cash fines to avoid paperwork. One neighbor had actually paid them in cash. No receipt. This wasn't random. It was organized. By evening, my cousins had built a rough timeline. The fake officers were hitting older homeowners, people who lived alone, people less likely to question authority. They used pressure, uniforms, and just enough aggression to scare them into compliance. Grandpa just happened to be the one who asked for proof and paid the price. What made it worse? The HOA board's reaction. When the family demanded answers, the board sent a carefully worded email. We regret the incident. We deny any association. We advise residents to contact local law enforcement. Not once did they mention increased security. Not once did they warn residents properly. It felt like they were more worried about liability than safety. My cousins noticed that too. That night, they gathered in Grandpa's garage. No bikes revving. No leather vests on display. Just jeans, boots, and calm voices. They laid everything out on a folding table. Notes, times, addresses, photos neighbors had secretly taken. One cousin had even pulled public records showing the HOA had recently cut costs by canceling overnight security patrols. That explained how the scammers were getting away with it. Still, there was one question that mattered most. Who were they? The next breakthrough came from something simple. A neighbor remembered part of the SUV's license plate. Not enough for police, apparently, but enough for my cousins. They cross-referenced it with traffic cam footage near the neighborhood entrance. Then gas stations. Then a convenience store 2 miles away. By midnight, they had a clear image of the vehicle. And the men. They weren't HOA employees. They weren't even local officials. They were part of a small crew that had been running similar scams in nearby towns, posing as utility workers, code enforcement, even pest control. Always targeting quiet neighborhoods. Always disappearing before things escalated. Except this time, things had escalated. Grandpa's broken arm wasn't just an injury. It was evidence. And suddenly, the story wasn't about HOA fines or compliance anymore. It was about assault, impersonation, and a scam that had gone unchecked for far too long. The police still said, "Give it time." My cousins looked at each other and nodded. Time was the one thing those fake officers no longer had. By the third day, the neighborhood could feel it. Something was shifting. Not loudly. Not obviously. But the usual calm had a nervous edge now. Curtains stayed drawn a little longer. People lingered at their doors when cars slowed down. Word about Grandpa's arm had spread, and so had the rumor that the men responsible weren't real HOA officers at all. That was when my cousins made their next move. They didn't go looking for trouble. They went looking for proof. One cousin filed a formal police report addendum, pushing the case beyond suspicious activity into felony territory. Assault on an elderly person. Impersonating officials. Organized fraud. That paperwork mattered, even if it felt slow. Another cousin contacted a local news tip line. Nothing dramatic, just enough detail to get a reporter curious. Names withheld. Faces blurred. But the phrase fake HOA enforcers targeting seniors tends to get attention. Meanwhile, the HOA board was unraveling. An emergency meeting was announced with barely 12 hours' notice. Residents packed the room. Grandpa didn't attend, doctor's orders, but his empty chair spoke louder than anything he could have said. Neighbors demanded to know why warnings hadn't gone out earlier, why security was cut, why complaints had been brushed aside. The board president stumbled through answers, eyes darting toward the association's lawyer every time someone raised their voice. Then one of my cousins stood up. Calm. Respectful. No threats. He laid out the timeline. The fake notices. The identical descriptions. The canceled security contract. And finally, Grandpa's injury. He didn't accuse the HOA of hiring the men, but he did accuse them of negligence. Of creating the perfect environment for scammers and then pretending shock when someone got hurt. That's when the room went silent. The board promised cooperation. Promised new security measures. Promised transparency. Too many promises, too late. The meeting ended with residents angry, scared, and suddenly aware that the people meant to protect the neighborhood had failed them completely. Outside, police cars rolled in. Not for arrests yet, but for statements. More neighbors came forward now that they knew they weren't alone. Fake warnings, cash demands, intimidation. The pattern was undeniable. What had started as Grandpa's fall was now a multi-victim case. Still, the men responsible were nowhere to be found. Until they made a mistake. 2 nights later, the white SUV reappeared at the edge of the neighborhood. Different street, different target, same routine. What they didn't realize was that half the houses now had cameras pointed outward. One neighbor called the police immediately. Another called my cousin. No one rushed in. No confrontation. No chaos. Instead, the neighborhood did something unexpected. They watched. The SUV idled too long. One man stepped out, clipboard in hand, confidence back in his walk. That confidence vanished the moment a patrol car turned the corner. Then another. Then another. The men tried to leave, but the exit was already blocked. This time, there was no disappearing act. The arrests were quiet, controlled, almost anticlimactic. But when the cuffs went on, something heavy lifted from the street. Officers recovered fake badges, printed notices, cash envelopes, and paperwork tying the group to multiple neighborhoods across the county. The news broke the next morning. Elderly residents targeted by fake HOA officers. Grandpa's story, his arm, was front and center, though his name was kept private. The HOA scrambled into damage control mode. Statements. Apologies. Emergency patrol contracts reinstated overnight. When my cousins visited Grandpa later that day, he looked lighter somehow. Still hurting. Still angry. But no longer blaming himself. He thanked them, quietly, and said something that stuck with all of us. I thought standing up would make it worse, he said. Turns out, staying quiet already did. Justice hadn't fully arrived yet, but it was finally moving in the right direction. And the people who thought they could hide behind fake authority were learning a hard lesson. Some families don't forget, and some neighborhoods don't look away once they see the truth. The arrest didn't end the story. They cracked it wide open. Once the fake officers were in custody, everything they'd touched started to unravel. Detectives linked them to a string of similar scams in nearby towns, all following the same pattern. Quiet neighborhoods, minimal security, and residents conditioned to obey HOA authority without question. Grandpa's case became the turning point because it was the first time someone was seriously hurt, and the first time a whole community pushed back instead of staying silent. The HOA board went into full panic mode. Within 48 hours, residents received more emails than they had in the previous 5 years combined. Emergency security patrols were reinstated. New cameras installed at entrances. A community safety task force was announced. The board president issued a formal apology, carefully worded by lawyers, acknowledging procedural failures, without admitting fault. To most of us, it felt hollow. Safety shouldn't require someone's arm to be broken first. Then came the legal consequences. Grandpa was contacted by the district attorney's office. Assault on an elderly person carries weight, and so does impersonating officials to commit fraud. The prosecutors wanted his testimony, not just about the fall, but about the intimidation, the confusion, the fear. Grandpa hesitated at first. He didn't like courtrooms, didn't like attention. But when he remembered how small and powerless he'd felt on his own driveway, he agreed. That decision changed everything. Civil attorneys started calling too. Not just for Grandpa, but for other victims who had finally come forward. One by one, stories surfaced. People who'd paid hundreds in cash, who'd been threatened with liens, who'd been too embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled. What united them wasn't money. It was anger and relief that they weren't alone. The HOA wasn't charged criminally, but they weren't spared either. Lawsuits for negligence piled up. Internal emails were subpoenaed. It came out that board members had dismissed early complaints as resident exaggeration. That phrase showed up in court documents, and it didn't play well with judges or juries. Meanwhile, Grandpa's recovery became a symbol. Neighbors stopped by with food, cards, and quiet apologies for not speaking up sooner. Someone fixed his fence. Another mowed his lawn every week without being asked. The same neighborhood that had once looked away was now watching out for each other, actively. My cousins stepped back at this point. Their job was done. They hadn't needed threats or violence, just persistence, attention, and unity. They'd proven something important. You don't have to become what you're fighting to stop it. The fake officers eventually took plea deals. Long sentences, restitution orders, bans from holding any position that involved authority or enforcement. Their operation was dismantled completely, names flagged across multiple agencies. No more costumes. No more easy targets. When the HOA announced new policies, mandatory ID verification, public officer rosters, direct police coordination, people listened this time. Not because they trusted the board again, but because the community demanded it. Grandpa attended the final HOA meeting months later. Arm healed, cane still in hand. When he stood to speak, the room fell silent. He didn't yell, didn't accuse. He simply said, "Authority without accountability hurts people. Don't let it happen again." No one argued. The neighborhood wasn't perfect now, but it was awake. And that made all the difference. Time did what it always does. It softened the sharpest edges, without erasing the lesson. Grandpa's arm healed, though the weather still made it ache sometimes. He joked about it, but everyone knew that crack on the driveway had marked more than a bone. It marked the moment our family and an entire neighborhood stopped assuming someone else would handle the hard things. The court cases wrapped up quietly. The fake officers were sentenced, restitution was ordered, and the scam ring was officially shut down. The headlines faded, replaced by newer stories, but the impact stayed local and personal. Every resident now knew how close they'd come to being next. Every door had a camera. Every official notice was double-checked. Blind trust was gone for good. The HOA changed too, though not out of kindness. New board members were elected. Meetings were crowded instead of empty. Decisions were questioned. Budgets were scrutinized. The phrase "just comply" disappeared from the neighborhood vocabulary. Authority now had to explain itself, and that shift alone made abuse far harder. Grandpa returned to his routines slowly. Morning walks, coffee on the porch, friendly arguments with neighbors about whose tomatoes were better. But there was something new in him, a quiet confidence. He no longer apologized for asking questions. When a real HOA officer showed up months later for a legitimate inspection, Grandpa asked for ID, documentation, and a phone number. The officer smiled and thanked him for being careful. That moment said everything. My cousins went back to their lives too, riding out in a low rumble one afternoon, nodding goodbye like nothing extraordinary had happened. They never wanted credit. They just wanted balance restored. To them, protecting family didn't mean fists or threats. It meant refusing to let fear run the rules. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't the broken arm or the fake badges. It was how easily it all could have continued. How many people had stayed quiet because they thought they were alone? How many trusted authority simply because it wore the right costume? Grandpa summed it up best one evening, as we watched the sun go down. They didn't win because they were strong, he said. They almost won because people were polite. That line stuck with the whole neighborhood. Now, politeness still exists, but it walks hand in hand with awareness. Respect comes with verification. And anyone who tries to hide behind fake power knows they won't be dealing with isolated houses anymore. They'll be dealing with a community that remembers what happens when you hurt one of its own and decides, together, that silence is no longer an option.